The street was quiet when the cameras stopped rolling. No music, no applause, just another afternoon in South Central Los Angeles, where stories didn't end when the screen went black. Years ago, a film warned America about a cycle of violence, choices, and consequences. It wasn't meant to glorify anything. It was meant to be a mirror, a warning, a plea. But what happened when the warning followed the people who helped tell the story? Most audiences remember Boys in the Hood as a powerful coming of age film, a cultural milestone, a moment in cinema history. What fewer people talk about is what came after, when the lines between acting and living began to blur, and for some, disappeared entirely. Three young men stood in front of the camera and played characters shaped by violence, pressure, and survival. Only one problem: when the film ended, life didn't reset. This isn't a story about Hollywood success. It's a story about what happens when a role refuses to stay on the screen. Because sometimes the most dangerous part of a story isn't what we watch. It's what follows the people who lived it. Before the cameras, before the scripts, before the weight of expectations, they were just young men trying to find a way forward. Lexi Bigham Jr. grew up in Chicago, far from the palm trees and movie sets of Los Angeles. He wasn't chasing fame recklessly. He studied, he trained. After high school, he spent time at Southern Illinois University, then moved west to attend the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in Pasadena. Stage work mattered to him. Discipline mattered. He performed in theater productions that demanded patience and depth long before most people ever recognized his face. Acting for Lexi wasn't about playing a tough guy. It was about craft. Diedrich D. Goldberg came from a different energy. Younger, louder, more restless. When he walked into his audition for Boys in the Hood, he didn't bring polish. He brought personality. Director John Singleton saw something familiar in him, the rawness of a kid shaped by his surroundings. D wasn't pretending to understand the streets. He lived close enough to them to feel their pull. That authenticity opened doors quickly, but it also came with risks no one stopped to measure. Then there was Lloyd Avery, too. His story surprised people the most. He didn't grow up surrounded by chaos. He came from a middle-class home in View Park. He attended Beverly Hills High School. His path could have led anywhere. Acting was not an escape for him, it was a choice. When he landed roles, people saw intensity and presence. No one looked at Lloyd and assumed his future would end behind prison walls. Each of these men entered the industry at a young age, carrying different backgrounds but sharing the same hope that talent could become stability, that a role could become a career, that the screen could offer distance from the streets, not pull them closer. Hollywood, however, doesn't pause to ask whether someone is ready for what success brings. It rarely provides guidance once the spotlight turns on. Young actors are celebrated for authenticity, for realism, for how closely they resemble the characters they portray. Few stop to consider what happens when that resemblance becomes a label. Before Boys in the Hood, none of them were symbols. None of them were warnings. They were students, sons, performers at the very beginning of their adult lives. What followed would transform their identities forever, not because of who they were, but because of what the world expected them to be. When Boys in the Hood was released, it didn't arrive quietly. It landed like a statement. The film spoke to America in a language many people were uncomfortable hearing. It showed violence without spectacle, consequences without heroism, lives shaped by moments that could not be undone. Audiences felt it. Critics acknowledged it. And suddenly, the young men on screen were no longer just actors. They were symbols. For Lexi Bigham Jr., the role of Mad Dog offered a brief but meaningful presence. He wasn't the loudest character. He wasn't the most violent. What made people remember him was restraint. A gang member who still showed humanity, a moment of kindness in a neighborhood where kindness rarely survived. The role didn't make him famous. but it gave him credibility, proof that he could leave an impression without dominating the screen. Diedrich D. Goldberg experienced something different. His character, Dookie, stood out immediately. The Jahari curl, the pacifier, the energy. Audiences laughed, but they also recognized him. He became familiar. That recognition opened doors quickly. Roles followed. Poetic justice, higher learning. D was no longer just a kid from the neighborhood, he was someone Hollywood was watching. Lloyd Avery II felt the impact in the most complicated way. His character, Knucklehead, became one of the film's most unforgettable images. The shotgun, the sudden violence, the senseless loss. Viewers didn't know his name, but they remembered his face. His performance carried weight, the kind that doesn't fade easily. With success came attention. With attention came expectation. Casting directors didn't see three individuals with different backgrounds. They saw familiarity. They saw realism. They saw street credibility. And slowly, roles began to echo each other. The industry rewarded what felt authentic without asking what authenticity cost the person carrying it. The film had warned about cycles, how environments shape identity, how choices narrow over time. Yet the irony was impossible to ignore. The same story that exposed the trap also helped reinforce it. For these young men, Boyz in the Hood was not just a breakthrough. It was a label. And once a label sticks, it becomes harder to separate performance from perception. The camera had stopped rolling, but the characters followed them into casting rooms, into interviews, into real life. This was the moment everything changed, not because of fame, but because the world began expecting them to live the very story they had acted out. Not every fall is loud. Some arrive quietly, without warning, and leave no time to recover. For Lexi Bigham Jr., the end came suddenly. He continued working, continued performing, continuing to build what looked like a steady path forward. He had just finished filming High School High when a car accident in Los Angeles took his life in December of 1995. He was only 27 years old. There was no scandal, no violence, just a life interrupted before it had the chance to fully form. In a story filled with chaos, his passing felt especially cruel, a reminder that even those who avoided the trap were not guaranteed safety. Diedrich D. Goldberg's story unfolded differently. The energy that once made him magnetic began pulling him toward risk. Street racing, late nights, alcohol. According to those who knew him, he lived fast and trusted the moment more than the consequences. On the 19th of November, 1994, after participating in a drag race, an encounter with members of the Bloods gang turned deadly. Words were exchanged. Tensions escalated. A gesture was misread. Gunfire followed. D was killed. A friend trying to protect him was also shot and died. D's girlfriend survived, but the bullet damaged her spinal cord, leaving her paralyzed from the neck down. He was 22 years old. Then there was Lloyd Avery II, the most unsettling transformation of all. What began as a performance slowly became a lifestyle. Lloyd moved away from his middle-class upbringing and into the jungles, a notorious Bloods territory. He marked his allegiance permanently, tattooing the word jungle above his eyebrow. Acting roles continued, but something had shifted. According to his brother, Lloyd suffered from what he called Tupac syndrome, the belief that playing a gangster meant becoming one. In real life, the consequences were final. Lloyd was arrested for a double homicide. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Inside prison walls, he changed again. He became religious. He led prayer services. He spoke openly about faith, even to his cellmate, Kevin Roby, a self-proclaimed Satanist serving multiple life sentences. The conflict was inevitable. An argument about God and the devil turned violent. Lloyd was beaten and strangled to death inside his cell at Pelican Bay State Prison in September 2005. He was 36 years old. In the film, violence was meant to teach a lesson. In real life, it refused to stop teaching long after the credits rolled. In the United States, stories like these rarely stay in the spotlight for long. They appear briefly, spark conversation, then fade behind newer headlines. When Boys in the Hood reshaped American cinema, it was praised for its honesty. Critics called it brave. Educators used it as a teaching tool. Hollywood pointed to it as proof that difficult stories could be told responsibly. But the industry focused on the film, not the people who carried its weight. There was no long-term support system for young actors suddenly labeled as authentic. No roadmap for separating character from identity. The same realism that made the film powerful became a cage when casting decisions narrowed, when expectations hardened, when the public assumed the roles reflected real lives. For older Americans watching from a distance, these tragedies felt familiar. They echoed broader questions the country has wrestled with for decades about opportunity, environment, and responsibility. Was this simply personal failure? Or did the system quietly step away once the box office numbers were counted? Outside the United States, the film was viewed as a cultural document, a snapshot of American urban life. International audiences studied it as sociology, as cinema, as warning. Yet the real aftermath never traveled as far as the film itself. The deaths, the prison sentences, the broken futures stayed largely invisible beyond brief news mentions. What remains hardest to confront is the silence that followed. No national reckoning, no sustained conversation about how often young black actors are cast into narrow lanes and left to navigate the consequences alone. The story ended when the credits rolled and America moved on. For many parents and grandparents watching today, this raises an uncomfortable truth. The warning was never meant only for the streets. It was meant for the audience too, for anyone willing to see how quickly talent can be consumed when guidance disappears. The tragedy was not just what happened to three men, it was how easily their stories were allowed to fade. Some stories end with answers. This one ends with a responsibility. Lexi Bigham Jr., Diedrich Goldberg, and Lloyd Avery II were not statistics. They were not footnotes in film history. They were young men who stepped into a story meant to warn the world and paid a price that no script could predict. Each life followed a different path, yet all were shaped by the same moment when art and reality collided. Boys in the Hood did what great films are supposed to do. It told the truth. It showed consequences. It asked America to look closer. But the lesson did not stop at the screen. It followed the actors home. It followed them into choices, environments, and expectations that proved difficult to escape. The legacy here is not tragedy for tragedy's sake. It is a reminder that talent without guidance is fragile, that authenticity, when rewarded without protection, can become a trap, and that stories about violence should never be mistaken for invitations to live them. For parents, grandparents, and anyone who has watched a young person search for identity, this story lands differently with time. It raises questions about mentorship, about responsibility, about what happens after the applause fades and the cameras turn away. These men did not fail the story. The story continued without a safety net. Today, their names resurface not as headlines, but as warnings quietly woven into film history. Their experiences remind us that representation matters, but so does care. That telling the truth is only the beginning, staying with the people who tell it is the real test. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a concern, a question, take a moment to reflect on it. Share your thoughts. Talk about it with someone who matters to you. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered with honesty and dignity, consider staying with this channel, because some lessons are too important to forget once the screen goes dark.